My name is Jean McGuire, and I want to welcome all of you who are joining us this evening in this People's Voice Forum. It's a forum to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the defeat of fascism in Europe, which was a very significant event, obviously. And we will be having two very outstanding speakers this evening to discuss that with us. The first speaker will be Jacques Pauwels, and he is a noted historian and an author, specifically on the wars in Europe, both the First and the Second World Wars. He has written on both of them. His books are known. One of them is The Great Class War, which is the book about the First World War, and the second one, Second World War, The Myth of the Good War, about America's role in it, and Big Business and Hitler. So those are three of his books, and he has others as well. And he will be discussing the significance of that war and the defeat of fascism. Our other speaker is Omar Latif. He is a member of the Communist Party, a leading member of the Communist Party, and a member of the Committee of Progressive Pakistani Canadians, and well known in Toronto as an activist in that field. So I want to welcome you all tonight. And before we start with the speeches, I'm going to ask Drew, who is standing by as part of our technical team, to explain to everyone how they will be able to ask questions when our speakers have finished. Drew, can you do that?
Yeah, thank you, Jean. So comrades and friends, it might take a couple seconds of searching, but you'll see on YouTube, if you're streaming from there, on your right-hand side, there is a live chat, and I can see some of you have already found it and are introducing yourselves. So that's good to get acquainted with it. But I guess typing questions in there after the two presentations when we're asked, or if you think about it during the talk, you can put it in there too, and I'll be collecting them and putting them into the meeting.
Okay, so Drew will be collecting those questions, and then when we get to the question period, he'll read them out for us as we come to them. Okay, so, you know, today we defeated, or fascism was defeated in the Second World War, but today we're watching again, some big business financing fascism. So I think it's a really good time for us to revisit the issue of what is fascism, what it's about, what its purpose is. And I'm going to call, first of all, on Jacques Pauwels to introduce his speech to us. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Jacques.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here this evening and to share a bit what I know about the Second World War and the First World War and the connection between the two. And I should say right away that I agree with many historians who today, looking back at the 20th century, see the First and Second World War are as two parts of the same big conflict. And that conflict is usually called the 30 Years' War of the 20th century. Now, the 30 Years' War is not a very familiar, widely known concept in North America, as far as I know, but in Europe, it rings more of a bell. The 30 Years' War was actually fought from 1618 to 1648, so quite a long time ago, mostly in and around Germany, and it ended up wiping out about a third of the German population. So it was a very long and very bloody conflict, and it lasted indeed 30 years. So when historians today talk about the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, starting in 1914, so to speak, and ending in 1945, so 31 years actually, they really conjure up this idea of a long, drawn-out conflict, very murderous, and also, I should point out, very complex, as wars tend to be, and especially world wars, because it involved many participants with many different objectives, and representing many different values, ideas, social and political systems. You can already see what I'm getting at. So the Second World War, certainly, to focus on that one then, part two of that big conflict, first of all, can only be understood if you know a bit about the First World War, and we get back to that later on. But I just want to focus on what we are dealing with today. That's the last day, well, the victory in the great conflict of 1939, 1945. It was May the 9th that the guns fell silent. So let's focus first on the Second World War. And as I just mentioned, wars are a very, very complex historical phenomena, and world wars are even more complex. And this one, again, like the 30 Years' War of the 17th century, had many players, to use that term. It's a stupid term, really, in the context, but people, many sides involved in it, and representing many different values and going for different objectives. So we should know, to simplify things as much as possible, not make it too simplistic, is that it was a war really, it was two wars rolled into one. And in this respect, what it was first of all, not first of all, maybe second of all, but it was on the one hand, an old-fashioned conflict between great powers. And here I should say not too old-fashioned, because the great powers involved were imperialist powers. Imperialism being the manifestation of the capitalist system that emerged in the late 19th century. It is basically capitalism on a worldwide international scale, involving the heartland, the metropoles like Britain and France and Germany and the United States, and on the other hand, the colonies. And I'm sure that Omar is going to say a few things about that later on. I can see already, getting ready for that. I'll leave that to him. But essentially, what we're saying is that the Second World War was a conflict among imperialist powers, and that, of course, is what the First World War had also been. As such, it involved two blocks of imperialist powers, who, while they were together fighting the common enemy, the other imperialist bloc, also had difference amongst themselves and different objectives and rivalries and competition and so on. I'm thinking, for example, the fact that in the Second World War, the United States and Britain were great allies, but certainly the rivalry, the traditional rivalry, going back to the years before the First World War, between Britain and the United States, the rivalry, even in hostility in which Canada was involved, of course, that was not a thing of the past by 1939, 1940. And it's fair to say that while the United States and Britain were united in their opposition to Nazi Germany, they were still also, in a sense, in a sort of conflict, rivalry situation. And it's fair to say that while they were both eliminating, in the long run, with the help of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, that the United States also managed actually to eliminate, you might say, Great Britain as a great rival in the Second World War by means of, for example, the Lend-Lease program, which was a system of loans to Great Britain, which people assumed too easily were a free gift, which they were not. They were loans at high interest rates, which Britain only paid off, I think, in 2007, and really got the country broke. And as Churchill at one point said to Roosevelt, you basically you're killing us. And Roosevelt said, well, do you want the credit or not? Because otherwise you're going to go down. You can't win the war against Germany. So that there is a typical example then of countries that were fighting alongside on this one same side in this conflict against Germany, but weren't necessarily the best of friends, or certainly didn't have the same interests at heart. But it was a conflict among imperialist powers, and on the one side it was, of course, Nazi Germany, the big imperialist threat, so to speak, the big boy that was a threat to the other big boys, namely Britain, France, and the United States. And that is one thing to keep in mind. But at the same time, the Second World War was also a conflict between the side, you might say, of capitalism and the side of socialism. And in that respect, actually, you might say that the side of socialism was clearly represented by the one existing socialist country at the time, and at the same time a pretty big power, and that was the Soviet Union. And capitalism was represented by, we should not forget that, by Nazi Germany, as well as the United States, as well as Britain, as well as France, everybody else, essentially. And here I should point out right away that it's totally wrong what some historians will try to tell you, that Nazi Germany was not a capitalist system, a capitalist country. Nazi Germany was 100% capitalist under Hitler, even though there was some minor aspects of the system that have been sort of cited to support claims, fake, phony claims, unjustified claims that Nazi Germany was not capitalist. It definitely was capitalist. In fact, Nazi Germany was a paradise for capitalism. The big bankers, the big German banks, and the big German corporations did very, very well under Hitler. Before the war and after the war and during the war, they made a lot of money. And by the way, as I point out in my book, The Myth of the Good War, those German banks, and especially corporations that did very well under Hitler because of his regressive social policies and because of his imperialist expansion, included also the branch plans in Germany, active in Germany, of foreign corporations, of which a lot of them were American. And that is, again, something that I emphasize in my book on the Second World War, and that yet most historians will never, ever, ever talk about that. They just mention it. It's as if this was of no importance whatsoever. The fact that, for example, Ford and General Motors had huge factories in Germany that produced untold amounts of weapons, including tanks and trucks and airplanes for the Nazis. And again, contrary to the idea that the fake idea that Nazi Germany was not capitalist, it was capitalist, and it did pay the bills. Hitler paid the bills. And of course, when you ask them how did Hitler pay the bills, it was basically by the losers in the war were going to pay the bills. The Jews paid the bills. The conquered countries paid the bills. Basically, Nazi Germany robbed France, robbed Holland, robbed Belgium blind to pay the debts it owed, and it kept paying money. In fact, the big German corporations and banks kept making money until the very, very end, which then caused a problem too, because they did not intend to give it all up when the war ended, did they? But that's a different story. That'll take us into the Second World War. I want to go back to what I was saying then about all this, that this was a conflict, also to simplify it, between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism, all the big imperialist countries, even though they were at war against each other, right? And then the one socialist country, the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union also was a state which in a war needed help where it could get it. And that would lead to this great coalition, that as it was called, I believe, the anti-Hitler coalition between the Soviet Union, the socialist camp, and some of the countries in the imperialist camp, and that Britain especially, and even the United States. But the United States, we should keep in mind, entered the war reluctantly. The United States backed into the war. The United States at first really had no desire to enter the war, at least not enter the war against Germany. Against the war against Japan was a different thing. That war they always wanted, which is why they provoked the attack on Pearl Harbor. But that's again a different story. We can get into that later on if you want to. I just want to mention then that the war was a complex conflict. Two conflicts rolled into one. And when today we commemorate the victory in that war, then we have to ask who won and who lost, or who won and who didn't really win, okay? We call it, I think the title of this is The Victory Over German Fascism. And that's fair enough, because the Hitler system, Nazism, was indeed a form of fascism. It was the German variation, the German brand of fascism, as Mussolini's fascism was the Italian brand, and Franco's the Spanish brand, and there was brands of fascism in every country. And so the war is often presented as a war against fascism. And the defeat of the most important form of fascism, German fascism, was in many ways is presented as victory over fascism. Fascism was defeated. Well, I have news for you. Fascism was not defeated. Fascism is still around. In fact, I want to read a little poem from Bertolt Brecht that comes to mind in this respect. And for those of you who know German, I'll read it in German first, and then I'll be translated for you. It says, so was hat einmal fast die Welt regiert. Die Völker wurden seiner Herr jedoch, dass keiner von uns zu früh triumphiert. Der Schoß ist fruchtbar noch, aus dem das kroch. And that sounds maybe a bit, hard to understand, but it's wonderful lines. Let me translate it. The entire world was almost ruled by such a monster. The nations managed to crush it. But let us not rejoice too soon. The womb it crawled from is still fertile. All right, so what we are saying here is that, what Brecht was saying by that is that even though fascism, Hitler fascism, Nazi German fascism was defeated in 1945, in many ways fascism survived. And it survived, and I'll just give you a couple of ways in which it survived. And in which, in a sense then, it shows that for many of the great powers on the imperialist side of that conflict, such as the United States, and particularly the United States, it wasn't really a war against fascism. Fascism was not really seen to be the enemy. In fact, as the United States helped to defeat fascism in Germany, because Germany was an imperialist rival, but not because they had against fascism. They actually saved the fascists in Germany in many ways. In fact, many leading fascists, including major war criminals, were given a passport and repatriated and sent off to live happily, long and happy lives in South America, as you know, and in Canada, quite a few of them. And not only German fascists, but fascists from Eastern Europe, from Croatia, from Ukraine, and you name it. And another way in which we can illustrate that fascism wasn't really the enemy for the Americans was that at the end of the war in 1945, it would have been very, very, very easy for the combined powers of Great Britain and the United States, plus Canada, the Canadian troops, to simply make a phone call to Madrid and tell that awful dictator Franco to step down, get the hell out of there, or else we're coming. And Franco would have had to pack his suitcases immediately and get the hell out of there. But instead, he wasn't bothered at all. Even though everybody knew he was the fascist, he was nominally the fascist, but he presided over a fascist system that kept on executing people, victims of the Civil War for years on end, and nobody ever undertook anything against that. And it's also fair to say that when the United States set up a presumably democratic state in Germany called West Germany, the Federal Republic, which is today has expanded to include the West, the East, it annexed the East. It wasn't not a reunification, it was an annexation of Eastern Germany by Western Germany. That West Germany, as it was set up in the late 40s, early 50s, under Konrad Adenauer, that was full of recycled fascists. I mean, the most famous example of that is Gehlen, who was basically one of the Secret Service men of the Nazis, active in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, and he actually was recycled by the Americans to become the head of the West German Secret Service. Ran it for many years together, hand in hand, happily, basically like Siamese twins with the CIA. And many Nazi generals who had to work diligently for Hitler were recycled to serve in NATO, in fact. And so there was a lot of German Nazis, fascists, who had been the enemies, so to speak, during the war, but were basically co-opted, were adopted in the great happy, Western family, after the war. So fascism really had not been the enemy at all. The German Reich had been the enemy, because the German Reich was a serious challenge to first the Brits and later on to the United States in the rush or the race, the conflict among imperialist powers to decide who was going to be the master of the whole system, who was be the hegemon, who was in charge. We all know who that would be. It would be Uncle Sam, right? So fascism was not the enemy. In fact, in my book, The Myth of the Good War, I cite some American generals from West Point who were at one point during the war still moaning that we're fighting against the wrong enemy, on the side of the wrong ally. Meaning, why are we fighting Hitler? He's a good guy. He's a fascist, And why are we fighting with the commies? We should be fighting with the fascists against the commies. And that is something that actually also appears from a number of other things. You may know or may not know that at the end of the war, as it was clear that Nazi Germany was kaput, but guys like Patton and Churchill were seriously considering, and I mean seriously considering, joining up with what was left over of the German army, and there was still quite a few men there, to basically march to Moscow, and Patton was very keen to do so, and so was Churchill, and they would have done so, except for one reason. You know why they didn't do it? Because the American soldiers wanted to go home. And I have a wonderful quote in my book about an American soldier who said, Patton is crazy. He said, I thought it was a veteran saying afterwards, after the war, Patton was crazy. He wanted us to march to Moscow. He said, we didn't want to march to Moscow. We wanted to go home. And we didn't want to march to Moscow, first of all, because the Red Army soldiers had fought with us, and we respected them and loved them for what they had done, because they had made all the sacrifices that made our life much easier and probably saved our lives, right? And secondly, we knew what the Red Army had done to Hitler's army at Stalingrad, and we didn't want to go to Moscow. And in fact, in the United States, there were strikes, and there were people that were clamoring, writing to their congressmen, we want the boys to come home. And also, it would have been very, very difficult for Washington and London to suddenly explain that we made a big mistake, guys. Sorry, we've been fighting the Nazis, but they weren't really bad guys. They were good guys, and we've been fighting with the Ruskies, and they're now the bad guys, so we're going to march to Moscow. I mean, that was something that the public never would have swallowed. It would take many, many years to socialize the public in the West to view the Russians as bad guys, and the Nazis sort of as, well, most Nazis, not the bad ones are dead, but I mean, most of the, for example, the German generals as pretty decent chaps, I mean, Hollywood has made it a point to show guys like Rommel as pretty nice fellows, essentially. I mean, they were war criminals, no doubt about it. But of course, they were smart enough never to join the Nazi party. They were the kinds of conservatives, straight-laced Germans of the old system that liked Hitler a lot, as long as he produced the successes which they wanted to share with him. But once they started to lose, they distantiated themselves from him, and they pretended they had never been Nazis. And there was many bankers and industrialists as well. Today, if you ask in Germany, if you ask big industrialists, not that I ever get to talk to them, but to any of them, or bankers or so, or the historians who write the books on their behalf, there's quite a few court historians, as we call them, who are paid sometimes to write a history of German corporations. I could give you some names of that. They always say that the general claim is that we didn't want to build all this aircraft, we didn't want to build things, but we were forced to by Hitler. And the banker, but we were forced to. It's just not true at all. It's just not true at all. The Nazi system was a system whereby the bankers and industrialists decided, and Hitler did what it was expected of him. That's why they picked him. They brought him to power. Another lie of the Third Reich is that Hitler was voted into power. He became the dictator democratically, so to speak. It's just simply not true at all. But just to come back to fascism. So fascism was not the fascist aspect of Germany that caused the United States to go to war. I'm focusing on the United States now, but you can say much the same thing about Britain and even about France. It was essentially the fact that it was a major competitor. But fascism in the 1930s, for example, was looked upon rather benevolently by the elites in Britain, in France, in the United States, in Canada as well. And I mean the political elites, the financial elites, the industrial elites, the church elites. I'm not saying that the ordinary priests or so were like Hitler, but most of the people, the higher ups, the elites liked Hitler. They liked fascism, and they liked them because they were basically, fascism was not a revolutionary system out to change the established order. It was the opposite of that. Communism, socialism, that was the system that was the threat to the established order, to those on top, the elite, the ones we sometimes call now the 1%. They hated communism, socialism, because it represented revolution, and that was a threat to their system. Right? So they had nothing to do with it, and they liked fascism because fascism was the opposite of communism. In fact, wherever fascism raised its ugly head, starting in England, it started already earlier, but where it came to power in Italy in 1922 with Mussolini, the first thing it did was wipe out the commies, the Reds, as well as socialists, social democrats, as well as labor unions and so on. So from the perspective of capitalists, bankers, industrialists, and many others, that was a fine thing to do. In fact, when Mussolini did that, Churchill, for one thing, sometimes ridiculously praised as a great Democrat, which he was not at all. Had high words of praise for Mr. Mussolini, who was the great gentleman from Rome, he called him. And in the United States too, most people liked Mussolini a lot, and even Hitler was a good guy, because as soon as he came to power, he basically threw all the commies into jail, into concentration camps, because the jails weren't big enough to accommodate them all. I mean, most people don't understand, or don't just know that the first concentration camps in Germany were not set up for the Jews. Their turn would come later, but for the communists. which of course included quite a few Jews, as we all know. But that's a different story again. So what we are saying is that after the war, the First World War, and after the Russian Revolution especially, to the elites in France, in Britain, in the United States, in Canada, the great threat was actually the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union embodied, it incorporated the revolutionary threat to the system which they represented, right? And the problem was, especially in the 1930s, in the context of the Great Depression, when things were tough as they are now, that more and more people in the West, even in the United States, which is, many people believe there was never ever a single communist or a single socialist in the United States. No way, they were all capitalism only. It's not true. It was the red 30s, the dirty 30s were the red 30s, when the communist parties and socialist parties and anarchists and all kinds of revolutionary elements and groups were actually having success. And that scared the hell out of a lot of people of the elite in these countries. So they all felt that that was all the fault of that country over there that symbolizes the revolution, the cradle of the revolution, and they're the ones who orchestrate all this revolutionary threat. So we got to get rid of that. Right? So the fear of the Reds, the great red fear, that was the big thing, right? The red peril. Now, how do you combat that? What's the solution for that? Well, the solution was fascism. Because wherever fascism came to power, as it did in Italy with Mussolini and in 1933 with Hitler, first thing he did was basically just close down the communist parties and the socialist parties, throw the commies in jail, shut down the labor unions, and right away, the revolutionary threat was gone. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get this guy to do the same thing on the Soviet Union? And this is where Hitler became interesting, because Hitler in Mein Kampf, which was published in 1925, had spelled out clearly what his big mission in life was. It was the destruction of the Soviet Union. And that's what he wanted. He didn't want war with France, he writes in Mein Kampf. He wanted war in the East. Germany's future was in the East, in the Soviet Union. So that's where we have to march. We have to march to Moscow. Now, that was music to the ears of people in the elites in France and in Britain and also in the United States. Because it meant that this guy, this new fellow there, with whom we could do, by the way, good business, was going to use the military might of Germany, which is still very, very big, not to bother us. No, he's going to go and march east and destroy the Soviet Union, which we hate anyways. I mean, what could be better? What could be better than have somebody else do the dirty work, which in a way we would prefer to do what we can because our public is against it. And besides, we tried, because at the end of the First World War, during the Russian Revolution in 1918, 1919, the Allies, the British, the Americans, Canada, the United States, Japan, sent troops to intervene in the Civil War in Russia, not to help the Reds against the Whites, no, to help the Whites against the Reds, And these Whites weren't exactly wonderful Democrats. I mean, they were basically the Tsarist forces who represented a medieval system, essentially. So Churchill, presumably a great Democrat, basically sent troops to help, to try to restore a feudal system, worse than might say, one of the most authoritarian systems and the most exploitative systems that you can think of. So the idea was then that fascism was the solution and communism was the problem, right? So the idea that we're going to fight a war now in which we are going to fight with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, if you would have told somebody that's going to happen, it's impossible. It's the opposite of what we want. We want the opposite. And that's why, as I mentioned later on, and even during the war still, there were generals in the States who said, we're fighting with the wrong ally against the wrong enemy. That we have to change that. Let me also point out that, for example, in the United States never wanted war with Germany, especially since when Hitler started to prepare for that war, which was going to go against the Soviet Union. When he started to prepare for that, he had no money and he had no weapons, because Germany was bound by the Treaty of Versailles to have only a tiny little army of 100,000 men, no air force, and oh my God, how can that man do the job and knock off the commies in the Soviet Union if he doesn't have a serious army, So Hitler started to rearm, and fine, we close our eyes to that, because we wanted to have a big army, right? And then he comes to power. Well, he was already in power when he started to rearm, obviously. I'm a little confused here time-wise. But then he needed to build tanks and airplanes. And he needed all kinds of stuff to fight that war. So he goes to the big companies in Germany, including the branch plants of American companies like General Motors. He says, I want you to build tanks and trucks and planes. He says, Chemist, how are you going to pay? How are you going to pay? He said, well, I'll borrow money. Well, if you want to borrow money, why don't you go see the banks? And the banks are keen because they have money, the German banks and American banks, and loan him the money to go and buy from their friends. And this is where the United States was again involved big time, because through his friend Hjalmar Schacht, a famous German banker with an American connection, because he had lived in the States, he actually managed to borrow money from American banks to float bonds, Nazi bonds, and with that money he went to buy what he needed in the United States. Actually, he bought from the American branch plants in Germany, like Ford and General Motors, but he also needed something else for the United States, because you see, it's one thing to have lots of tanks and airplanes, Stukas and all that, to attack, to carry on a lightning type of warfare, which is a motorized warfare, which involves tanks driving hundreds of thousands of kilometers, and airplanes flying, Stukas bombing it. Where does Germany going to get the fuel? Because if those planes and those tanks could run on beer, Germany would have had no problem, because there's lots of beer in Germany. But oil, zero. Petroleum, zero. The reality is that Hitler had to import and stockpile before the war petroleum. And whether to get it, the answer is from the one country that was still the major producer and exporter of oil, of petroleum before the war, and that was the United States. And here's the typical example, the best example of that is a banker in New York in the 1930s who specialized in actually floating bonds, German Nazi bonds in the United States, promising a good return to money. And that was the Union Bank of New York, whose head was Prescott Bush, the grandfather the father of one president and the grandfather of another president. And a lot of people think that the Bush family were always in the oil business. No, they got into the oil business. Why? Because Prescott Bush made so much money, basically raised so much money for Hitler, and saw that he was using it to buy oil from his friend, the Rockefellers, that he told his son, George, come over here, here's so much money, go to Texas and get into the oil business. There's wonderful money to be made. And I'll get you some contracts with Nazi Germany. And actually, when Nazi Germany attacked Poland and later on Belgium, Holland, France, the Soviet Union, it was mostly with oil that had been sold to him at very high prices, by American companies. So Hitler's plan to launch a war to destroy the Soviet Union was a wonderful arrangement from the point of view of the elites in all these countries, because it meant that he was going to wipe out that pain in the neck embodiment of the revolution, the Soviet Union, a source of inspiration and guidance for our own goddamn Reds. And secondly, by preparing for this war, we're making the money because he's buying from us. But hold for a second, Mr. Hitler, we're loaning you the money, the banks, and you use that money to buy from our colleagues here from Ford and General Motors to buy all these weapons. But how are you going to pay us back? Well, that's easy. The war is going to be an ordinary war. The war is going to be a war of conquest. The losers will pay. And that's fair enough. That's fair enough. You got credit. In other words, the payment will come from the conquests. And that's indeed what happened. Hitler did finance his operations, starting in 1939 and 40, by looting the countries he conquered. When he entered Belgium, for example, he got all the gold out of that Belgium had, quite a bit, mostly from the Congo, Anyways, so the war was going to pay. And that's why when these business people in the 30s, when they dealt with Hitler, and they sold them all this war equipment and the petroleum needed to fight these wars, that they never had any qualms about that, because they knew damn well the war was going to be against the Soviet Union, and they loved it. And that rape of the Soviet Union was going to enable Hitler to pay the bills. So in fact, that war had to come sooner or later, because we can't wait forever for Mr. Hitler to pay his bills off, right? So that's what happened. That's why in this context, we can understand, for example, that the United States had no plans for war against Nazi Germany at all. Because in fact, all the great leaders of the United States, the political, the economic, the financial leaders, they all left Hitler. If you would have told them, don't you want to go to war against Hitler? They would have said, what for? And if they would have said, well, he's a racist. So what? We're racist ourselves. So he's anti-Semitic. Well, we're anti-Semitic ourselves. In fact, you may or may not know that the major source of anti-Semitic inspiration for Hitler was Henry Ford, who wrote a book in 1922 called The International Jew, where he basically blames socialism, communism, the Russian Revolution on the goddamn Jews, because Marx was a Jew and Hitler was, sorry, not Hitler, and Trotsky's a Jew and Lenin was a Jew. He was not, doesn't matter. All Jews, you know, from the perspective of Hitler and Ford, you know, communism, socialism was actually an invention by the Jews to subvert the natural God-given supremacy of the white folks. And it was just those jealous Jews, you know, that are among us. That's the problem, right? Because the blacks and the brown people are also, but they're not here. But I mean, the Jews are among us. So that's a big problem, right? They're among us, you know. And they just like, they're inferior, but they're dangerous, they're jealous. And they've invented this system called socialism, you know, communism, you know, to basically subvert us. And the Russian Revolution, that was the work of the Jews. By the way, a lot of people still believe that today, you know that, right? And it was the Russian Revolution was the work of the Jews. And the Soviet Union, as Hitler saw it, there was Russland unter Judenherrschaft. That's Russia under the Jews. So the communist regime in Moscow, that's the Jews running the country. Yeah. That was his idea. And where did he learn that? He learned it from Henry Ford. And actually that was what, generally speaking, what anti-Semites everywhere believed. You know? And that's why the idea that Hitler was a racist and an anti-Semite, that didn't bother anybody. I mean, it was expected. I mean, of course you were anti-Semite. I mean, you were an anti-communist, you were anti-Semite. Anti-Semite, you were anti-communist. The two were the same side, the two sides of the same coin, on the same coin, not the same side of two coins. Anyways, you get the picture. So there was no plans for war against Russia, against Nazi Germany. The United States had plans for war against three countries. Japan. And indeed, that's a different story. You know, but the attack against Pearl Harbor, that was a provoked arrangement because the United States wanted war against Japan. I can tell you, explain to you later on if you want, if you have time, why. Secondly, Mexico. And we say, why Mexico? Wars against Mexico had always been very, very productive, you know, very profitable. You know, in the 1840s, the war against Mexico had land and a bit of real estate, you know, on the side of the American border. Think of California, New Mexico, Arizona. And, you know, that was a third of the territory of Mexico. You know, I think they're going to give it back shortly, but maybe not. Anyways, and the third country for which the United States had plans for war in 1939, 1940 was Great Britain and Canada combined, seen as one. Even though we were already more or less independent, I guess at that time, it didn't matter. From the perspective of the United States, Canada was still part of Britain. And those plans were made public in the 1950s. And everybody laughed it off. It was so embarrassing, right? And what did it include? What did it involve? It involved bombing three big cities in Canada. Because they weren't going to send the bombers over to Britain yet. They were going to bomb Canada. They expected Britain to send troops to Canada, you know, to fight a war. And of course, Halifax would be where the Navy would land, right? Well, therefore, we would bomb the hell out of Halifax. And Toronto and Vancouver, with poison gas bombs, by the way. And I'm not making this up, okay? I'm not making this up. This is totally, the documents are there. It's totally known. Like I say, when this came out, it was it was pretend that it was a joke, but it was not. There was no plans for war against Nazi Germany. None whatsoever. In fact, when I ask people, when did the United States declare war on Nazi Germany? Most people don't know that. And they usually then say, well, at Pearl Harbor, you know, December 1941. And I said, well, it's close. It was around that time, but it wasn't really at that time. And besides Pearl Harbor, that was the Japanese attacking an American possession, colonial possession, you know, without the Germans even knowing about it. So the day after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt asked the Congress to declare war on Germany. On Japan. And he did not say, and while we're at it, let's declare war on Germany. You know, some historians say, oh yeah, Roosevelt wanted war against Germany. It's not true. He didn't. That's not true at all. In fact, because Germany had nothing to do with it. Hitler had to read it in the paper pretty well. But Hitler declared war on the United States on the 12th of December, 5 days after Pearl Harbor. And it came as a big shock. It was totally unexpected in Washington. Totally unexpected. In fact, that's a fascinating kind of a tidbit of information that most people aren't aware of. And it has some interesting implication, because what happened to the American companies, the American branch plants in Germany, did Ford, General Motors, IBM, ITT, Singer, sewing machines now make machine guns for the Nazis? Did they keep operating? You never read anything about that in the movies, in the books, right? And Hollywood is not going to make a movie about that, But the fact is, yes, they kept on operating. And if you'd ask managers or people of these companies, weren't you guys active in Nazi Germany and during the war? They may say, yes, from 1939 to 1941, but we're a neutral country. Therefore, that was fair, right? I mean, neutral countries, we're not at war, so we could sell oil and we could do business. So, yeah, but what about after Pearl Harbor? Oh, yeah, I'm glad you asked. Of course, not glad you asked. But yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, but we confiscated. We were confiscated. Our branch plants were confiscated by the Nazis. Okay, end of discussion. Is it true? No, it's not true. It's an outright lie. They just kept on business as usual. And they kept on producing. They kept on making money. Okay, big time until the very end. In fact, during the war, they made even more money than before. And why is that? Because the Nazis kept paying, by the way, for example, with the gold or the teeth of their Jewish victims and so on. But why did they make even more money? The answer is slave labor. Slave labor. I mean, labor costs, as you know, are a nuisance for capitalism. That is so. It would be so nice there'd be no labor costs whatsoever, of course, right? I mean, to minimize them, that'd be great. But I mean, it's kind of hard to do without workers of some sort, less and less, of course. But the problem was slave labor. That's the favorite. It's a favorite of all. It's slave labor. It's cheap, very cheap. All you have to do, the only cost involved is a few potatoes a day for food, and you have to make a donation to the SS, because they have to look for the discipline, you see. And that solves the problem. So that is why they did wonderful business at that time. Now, the branch plants then were not closed down by the Nazis. The American branch plants kept producing for the Nazis. And the war basically continued then for them. Was business as usual. But the question was, and the question I should get to is, why did Hitler declare war in the United States? Because he didn't have to. He didn't have to at all. And in fact, some people say, oh yes, he had to because he was an ally of Japan. So he had to. It's not true. They were allies, but committed to come to each other's defense in case the other party was attacked by somebody, not in case the other party attacked someone. When Hitler attacked Poland in 1939, Japan didn't declare war on Poland. When Hitler attacked Belgium, Holland, France, and tomorrow, exactly 80 years ago, on the 10th of May, 1940, Japan didn't declare war on Holland, Belgium, and France. When Hitler attacked the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, Japan, which had already fought an undeclared war against the Soviet Union in 1939 and got a bit of a bloody nose, did not declare war on the Soviet Union, although there was a great concern, a great worry in Moscow, but it didn't. So Hitler was not forced, absolutely not, to declare war on the United States because he was an ally of Japan. He could have done what Japan did to him when he started his wars. Send him a success card, say, hope you do well, good luck, good luck with your war, but we don't get involved in it, but he did. And the reason why Hitler did declare was out of total desperation, because he thought declaring war would be the only way to avoid the catastrophe which was already appearing on the horizon. Because he declared war on the 12th of December, 1941. Okay, so 5 days after Pearl Harbor. Was the 11th? A few days earlier, a week earlier, on the 5th of December, Hitler's generals had shown up in his office and told him, Mr. Hitler, can't win the war anymore. You're going to lose the war. You're going to lose the war. Not right now, but you can't win the war anymore. Why is that? Because in front of Moscow, where we were only about 20 kilometers from the Kremlin, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive, and they've beaten the hell out of us. and we're just barely surviving. In fact, we'd be lucky to survive in the winter, and that means we are going to lose the war. Because as you know, Mr. Hitler, didn't tell him that, but I'm telling you that. We also went to war against the Soviet Union, not only to fulfill your lifelong dream of destroying the Soviet Union, the cradle of communism, but we also did it because to get our hands on the resources of the Soviet Union, to first of all pay off our debts to the banks, but that's a concern for later, but to keep on fighting the war. Because we have to fight the war to keep on fighting the war, meaning we have to defeat the Soviet Union to get especially the oil fields of the Caucasus and the agricultural riches of Ukraine and whatever else they have the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will be for us what India and Pakistan had been to the Britain, what the Wild West, the conquest of the West, had been to the United States, meaning a big agricultural heartland, chock-a-block full of resources, of raw materials to feed our population, to feed our factories, to keep us going. When Hitler launched the attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the German army had petroleum to fight for 4 months and no more, because the stockpiles had run low as the panzers had overrun Poland, Holland, Belgium, France, and now the Soviet Union, right? Well, now they were about to overrun the Soviet Union. And that involves hundreds of thousands of millions of miles of travel for all these machines, right? Because there was hundreds of thousands of airplanes and tanks involved. So it was a must for the Soviet Union, for the Germans to defeat the Soviet Union within 4 months to get the oil fields of the Caucasus. And that was the idea. And how long did they think it was going to take? Well, in Berlin, on the eve of the attack on the Soviet Union, it was firmly believed that the war might take something like 2 or 3 months, be game over. Because the Soviet Union was seen as a very weak country, run by a bunch of Jews anyways, who didn't know the difference between, but they're not like good Germans who know how to fight a war, right? It'll collapse. The Soviet will totally collapse. In fact, in Britain, where they were happy that Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, because Britain was the only country still fighting at that time, France had been eliminated, they were very happy. They felt temporary relief, because in Britain too, the Army High Command figured a couple of months, 8 weeks perhaps. And the sitting in the Soviet in Washington, they believed that the expressions used were of its glory, of its power, of its fame, will go through the Red Army like a hot knife through butter. That's exactly the term used by the generals in England at the time. And at first it looked that way, didn't it? At first it looked really, really, really good. But already after a few weeks, the advance started to slow down. And by the fall, it was already obvious to many cognoscenti, many observers who knew that things were not going the way they should. In fact, the German soldiers were supposed to have been back in their factories by September 1st. And it was still a long way from the Caucasus. And then as things were getting desperate, then on the 5th of December, the Red Army launches a counteroffensive. And that's the end of the dream of defeating the Soviet Union in that year, or for that matter, at any given time after that. And that's why Hitler is sitting there at that time. He's been told that he's going to lose the war. Yeah. He can no longer win because he didn't defeat the Soviet Union. And they know the Soviets are still very strong. And by the way, we all know that the Soviet Union suffered enormous losses, especially that first summer of the war, but so did the Germans. The Germans lost like 500,000 men, which is for them they had never in the previous campaigns in Poland, Belgium, Holland, France, they had never suffered that kind of losses. And they ran into weapons that they didn't know the existence of. Hitler was furious at the secret services that the Soviets appear to have tanks and all kinds of weapons, superior tanks and weapons, which they produced, by the way. And don't let anybody tell you that the Soviets survived only because the generous Uncle Sam provided him with weapons, because he did not. In fact, at the beginning of the war, the American ambassador in the Soviet Union sent a warning to Washington: don't supply any weapons, don't sell anything to the Soviets, because they're not going to survive for another few months. So it's just by the time the weapons are going to get here, the Nazis will get them. In fact, Lend-Lease help to the Soviet Union only arrived a year after the Soviets had single-handedly with their own efforts and with their own equipment, survived the attack by the Nazis. Right? So that is why Hitler then is thinking about that he's going to lose the war. And suddenly he realizes maybe there's one way to get out of this. Because he reads in a paper, essentially, the day after Pearl Harbor, that Japan, his buddies in Tokyo, have attacked the United States without telling him anything about it. And he has no obligation whatsoever to help them in the war against the United States. But he does declare the United States as a dramatic gesture, which he hopes will impress Tokyo so much that Tokyo will declare war on his enemy, the Soviets. And if they do that, you have to keep in mind the bulk of the Japanese army is in eastern China, occupying a part of China, in Manchuria, and they attack the Soviet Union there. Then the Red Army will have to fight a war on two fronts. And then, that's Hitler's logic, and then maybe, just maybe, we still have a chance to win the war in the Soviet Union. Or maybe come to some sort of conclusion, an armistice or whatever, right? That's not a possibility. So Hitler, it's a tremendous gamble. And very likely his generals told him, I don't know about that, that may not work. And then you're going to have another enemy, the United States. But Hitler says, well, that's not a concern right now because it'll be years before the Americans will show up here. And then he was right. The Americans didn't really show up until 1944. And I'm talking about December 1941. So anyways, I wanted to tell you then that is how the United States became involved in the war against Germany, which they didn't really want to become involved in at all. And that explains then why they were fighting now against Germany, even though they didn't want to. And they certainly aren't fighting against fascism, against Nazism. They don't mind that at all. What they do mind is that the ambition of Germany to control Europe and to challenge the United States, which is itself aspiring to supremacy, you might say, in what we now call the Western world, the imperialist world, if you want. And that is something that is another issue then that it shows again this complexity of the war, because you have on the one hand the countries, powers, imperialist powers fighting each other. At the same time also you have the conflict between capitalism and socialism. Did I talk too long already, or is it okay? I don't hear anything there, but shall I stop here maybe, and we can always come back to some of this later on? I can't hear anything. Oops. No,
I'm sure people are really going to want to ask a lot of questions, Jacques.